I'm the coordinator of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space, an international network of about 135 affiliated groups all over the world that are working to stop the nuclearization and weaponization of space.
At the end of June 2006, members of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space convened from all over the world at the World Peace Forum in Vancouver, Canada. During the week-long Peace Forum, which was attended by more than 4,000 scholars, government officials, heads of international relief agencies, and peace workers from around the world, the Global Network gave a series of presentations on the dangers presented by the weaponization of space.
The weaponization of space may represent the greatest and most urgent danger for the very future and the very survival of our civilization. Now look, when we talk about the weaponization of space, we're not simply postulating about something that might happen in the distant future. There's already an abundance of irrefutable evidence that the United States intends to place weapons in space beginning as early as 2008. Both the Russians and the Chinese know this, they both understand this, and although they strongly oppose the weaponization of space themselves, they feel they will have no choice but to deploy their own offensive and defensive weapons regardless of the potentially cataclysmic consequences. There is zero question that the United States intends to, quote, control space, end of quote, and plans to, quote, deny others the use of space, end of quote, for any purpose that the United States now opposes or may sometime oppose in the future. Even though, ultimately, there's no doubt about this, that the United States would be infinitely more secure by joining in with other nations in opposing space weaponization, the military-industrial complex in the United States has grown so powerful in Washington that rationality relating to perceived threats from China no longer exists, and growing administration paranoia reigns supreme. While Russia once again is considered to be a threat to the Pentagon, it's Beijing that is the focus of the growing fears that exist in Washington. The bottom line here, the bottom line is that it's not just Taiwan that could provoke a deadly confrontation between the world's major superpower and a rapidly emerging new giant superpower. Oil and other resources are bound to pose significant dangers to peace, as will, of course, American weapons in space. A few words about Russia. Last month, the Kremlin chief of staff accused the United States of planning, quote, a whole new arsenal of new destabilizing weapons, end of quote. Meanwhile, for over a year, Russia has been claiming unrivaled success in the development of new missiles capable of penetrating any missile shield. The new Topol-M and Bulava ballistic missiles are each equipped with 6 nuclear warheads, and Russia has reaffirmed plans to maintain a minimum of 2,000 warheads for as far as one can speculate into the future. Not to be ignored are the many and increasing signs of unprecedented Russian and Chinese military, economic, and political cooperation. Both countries are firmly opposed to the weaponization of space. Both countries have pleaded many times for an effective anti-weapons in space treaty, and both will certainly respond with their own space weapons when the United States forces them to do so. Well, of course, the greatest irony in all of this is that U.S. policy of placing weapons in space will seriously reduce U.S. security rather than increasing it, just as the invasion of Iraq substantially increased the potential for future attacks on the United States rather than increasing so-called homeland security. Further irony is that by withdrawing from the existing international agreements such as the 1972 ABM Treaty, and by failing to support or by actively blocking, as they're doing now, effective agreements on non-proliferation fissile materials, nuclear testing, the development of space weapons, and other international agreements, the United States, rather than increasing protection for the American people, is actually increasing the danger of attacks on the United States. Yet another further irony is that there's an abundance in scientific documentation showing that space weapons are not only terribly, terribly, terribly expensive, but at the same time, they are vulnerable to far less costly countermeasures. For the Rumsfelds, the Cheneys, the White House and defense hawks, it's inevitable that space is going to be weaponized, so the U.S., quote, had better be in there first, end of quote, in, quote, this ultimate high ground, end of quote, battlefield of the future. That's the kind of talk you hear in the Pentagon and in the White House these days. This means deploying anti-satellite weapons, sensors and lasers and hit-to-kill weapons, plus space-to-ground weapons, including powerful, enormously destructive lasers, so-called tungsten rods of God. It means satellite jamming and destruction and the disruption of communications. For the Pentagon, space superiority will be essential and the utmost importance in all future battles.
The interesting thing is that the Space Command has early designed missile defense as a key to start the process towards weaponization of space. What you see is a diagram from the 1998 report of the Space Command, which gives a timeline here from 95 to 2020, and designs different activities which could be put under the cover of a missile defense program. A defense program. So in the eyes of the American public, this would see as something legitimate, and put space warfare activities under this cover of the missile defense program. So that's basically the strategy, because the space weaponization is not very popular. And our aim is basically to uncover this, to show what the plan is and how the space weaponization fits to this missile defense program. You see, for instance, the ground-based laser and the ground-based interceptor here. Space weapons policy is part of it, getting rid of the ABM treaty. Interestingly, they designed it for 2005, and actually the Bush administration has done this earlier, getting rid of the ABM treaty, 2002. The airborne laser, space operations vehicle, space-based laser, and a fully integrated system in about 2020. So altogether for missile defense is about $48 billion planned for the next 5 years, and much more until the year 2024, more than $100 billion altogether. And this is, at the moment, it's only a smaller fraction of a couple of $100 million for space weaponization, but this is a great concern because it would pass a threshold, because there are no space weapons yet, and with these activities there is a threshold. Laser warfare in outer space means you destroy objects in microseconds because of the speed of light. Anything in range can be destroyed very easily, and that's a big problem also for the missile defense program itself. If several countries had these laser weapons in space, they could attack each other and destroy each other. And in seconds, that means you have only very short decision time, because your missile defense capability, if you had one, would be reduced by an opposing laser weapon. The key problem is here the decision time. Usually, you had during the Cold War times, you had a decision time of half an hour, which was the flight time of a ballistic missile. But with missile defense and space warfare, you go down to decision times of seconds. What we want to do is increase decision time with arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation from hours to days, months, and even years. You have heard about maybe about the electromagnetic pulse. If you explode a nuclear weapon at high altitude, then all electronics and the visible range could be affected by this. But also the objects in outer space are affected by this nuclear explosion and can be destroyed. So we need a lot of hardening against these nuclear attacks. The problem really is, can you prevent a nuclear explosion out of space if there is a space warfare? For instance, for China and Russia, that would be the cheapest countermeasure if there is a space warfare going on, simply to explode their nuclear weapons into outer space. And these would be largely affect all US satellites in range. And not only that, but what makes it more complicated, that part of the radiation of this nuclear explosion is captured in the Van Allen radiation belt.
One of the reasons why it was decided in 1967 to try to avoid exploding nuclear weapons in outer space is it does indeed affect the Van Allen belts. And the Van Allen belts, folks, are absolutely essential to life on Earth, among many other things. They prevent, now it's been a long time since I've taken astrophysics, so please bear with me if I got a few facts wrong here, but in my remembrance, they are critical to preventing the proton winds from the sun, especially during solar flares, from frying life on Earth. And so we really don't want to mess with them. The politics and and particularly to the response that the Russians and Chinese are likely to make to all of this. Now, they have talked about asymmetric response. Now, what asymmetric response is beginning to look like is already very scary because the Russians have already started to do it. And they, according to Bruce Blair at least, they have got something called a dead hand system. And what this means is if they can't, if their command and control system is knocked out by any means, but also by space weapons or what have you, then there is a form of automatic early release to local regimental, they call them regiments and divisions in those strategic rocket forces, the regiments and divisions of the strategic rocket forces to allow the local commanders the authority to fire independently of central command. This is terrifying. This means that some low-level general, a colonel, a major, depending on who survives, could make the decision to launch not one, but in the way the Russians are organized, hundreds of missiles all at once. And anything that makes the Russians more afraid that they can't tell what's going on, and I'm afraid this entire system, I'm just trying to be very simple here, this higher space architecture is going to do that, threatens us because what the other end of those missiles, the end of their flight trajectories is us, not them. So please understand, we are really playing with fire. In a very, very big way, and that if any form of balance is to be achieved, if any way of getting out of and getting down, going beyond the Moscow Treaty to something that actually will work, then we have got to back away from this in some fashion or other. Otherwise, we're going to push the Russians because that's the cheap and easy way for them to do it, is what they call asymmetric measures. And all of those things, however, are frighteningly dangerous.
In a recent space war game, U.S. commanders found that preemptively deploying or denying an opponent's space-based information assets could lead to a rapid escalation. One, quote, enemy, end of quote, commander commented, "If I don't know what's going on, I have no choice but to hit everything using everything that I have."
I think many of you have seen this diagram, which is also from the Space Command, and it designs an integrated Earth-space warfare, all the different kinds of satellites in space, military and civilian rockets on the Earth that launch objects into outer space, a national missile defense system, the Navy is part of it, and the Army and the Air Force, and laser weapons and kinetic kill vehicles are part of this program. So the basic aim is to control outer space. That means use space objects such as surveillance systems or laser weapons or communication systems to control activities on outer space and even deny other countries access to outer space.
Compare all of this with the low cost of a variety of defensive devices which will be employed against space weapons, and compare it all with the dangers of an all-out war that will very probably be precipitated by space weapons. And stop for a minute to contemplate what the meaning of the decision to, quote, hit everything, end of quote, and, quote, use everything in a future war. The deployment of space weapons will immediately produce dangers, instability, and feelings of vulnerability that other nations will feel must be addressed. As Dubois, Garwin, Kemp, and Maxwell suggest, the best U.S. strategy would be, quote, an aggressive campaign to prevent the deployment of weapons by other nations, which might best be implemented by a U.S. commitment not to be the first to deploy or test a space weapon or to further test destructive anti-satellite weapons.
The Russians and the Chinese genuinely want and have been pushing for some years for a treaty to ban weapons in space and for all the elements that would be connected with that. And it is, you know, I track the Conference on Disarmament rather closely, and the major bloc, following China's compromises 2 years ago, has continued to be the US, and the US is absolutely unprepared to deal with the space weaponization issue at all.
I will be very brief. June 19th, what's that, 6 days ago? The Deputy Director of Nuclear and Security Affairs for the U.S. State Department in Washington said this: there's no consensus, he said, about the supposed weaponization of space. And, now listen to this, the Conference on Disarmament is not the appropriate venue for any such discussions. And, quote, it's impossible to define a workable ban on space-related weapon systems.
Oh, stop being wussies for the brotherhood of man. We're planning a war in space. Why would we do it? We do it 'cause we can. We're planning a war in space. We'll rule the earth from heaven with our lasers aimed below, with echelon and satellites. There's nothing we won't know. They'll do just what we tell them, or up in flames they'll go, planning a war in space. For Aerojet, U-Space, and Lockheed Martin, we're planning a war in space. For Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, and for NASA, we're planning a war in space. We won't be free of CEOs when ruling from the skies. The power-hungry stockholders have profits in their eyes. We'll fire the whistleblowers if somebody falsifies. Planning a war in space. But nobody does it like the country we love best, for the ruling corporations, calling out the SWAT teams and the riot police to guard them from protesters at peaceful demonstrations. Who do you love? Who do you love? Tell me where you stand. Tell me where you stand. Tell me where you stand.
People make money off this. People make money off this. People make money off this. And that is what this is all about. And that is the point about which ignorance or lack of vision or lack of clarity is the biggest problem that we have. That people not understanding what we're talking about here is the right of corporations to make money no matter how many people they kill, because they don't care about that. What they care about is the money.
What these guys are doing is providing the solutions to running a business. Now they're helping Boeing, which is, as I said earlier, the biggest missile defense. It's the prime systems integrator for missile. The whole program, hundreds of companies, all doing different things. It's probably the biggest I think, what is it, Bruce? The biggest industrial program in world history. Yeah. So in order to run the biggest industrial program in world history, you need some pretty good software, and Cognos provides that. And some people might say, well, it's not really a weapons company, but it's the same sort of a function that IBM fulfilled for Nazi Germany. Providing the computer systems for helping them run their whole program smoothly, and etc.
They're all wearing camouflage.
Okay, here we are back to McDonald Detweiler & Associates, MDA. One of its main roles is to target alleged missile sites for first strike attacks during future theater missile defense operations. Now, this one is interesting. This is very important, very important. This is one of the world's biggest war industries. It's in Montreal. It makes really amazing simulation technology so that you sit down in this fake cockpit and it actually looks like you're in a warplane of whatever kind, because they provide these simulated environments for almost every kind of weapons delivery system known to the United States, at least, and other countries. So That's how we usually think of them, you know, as these it's simulated systems, so that you're in the cockpit, you've got all your controls, and you're looking through the window, and they have the image of what it's going to look like with the hills and everything, and you're flying over a 3D recreation of the hills that, you know, you're going to have to fly over to drop your bombs on Iraq or wherever. So you can do it like 20, 30 times, you know, fly the airplane and over the hills and around and like that, and then when you go and do the real thing, hey, you've already done it 20 times, so you're probably not thinking about this time when I push the button, I'm killing thousands of people. But anyway, CAE also uses this amazing simulation technology to help the weapons makers in the creation process, the process of creating the weapons, so that you don't have to build a prototype anymore. It's all simulated, so you don't have to go through the process of create the prototype, and then you test it, and then you have to modify it a bit, so you have to build another prototype. This is all done. It's all done with computer simulation. So it's part of the creation, development, testing of weapons in the first place. And they got a contract with Boeing, which is the #1 missile defense corporation, and it's like the lead systems integrator for the whole missile defense weapons program. Defense industries, oh, come on. I'm not against defense, you know, and they're setting us up with that term, and we should never use that term. It's a euphemism, and this is what they call themselves. This is the propaganda, the facade, the nice face that they put on themselves. This is not what we should call them. So, you know, and if you're a little bit shy away from calling them war industries, you know, you don't want to, I mean, they are war industries. But if you don't feel good about just war industry, just say military. Military is neutral. Just say military industry. Don't say defense industries. Don't let me catch anybody saying defense industries in here, because you'll be in trouble.
I would suggest to you that in the last 5 years, since the recession, since the Enron scandal, the U.S. corporation has changed beyond recognition. Someone who was looking at a defense contractor, Richard said, don't use the word defense, and I would agree, military aerospace contractor in 1999 would not be able to recognize that same contractor nowadays, because the corporation has changed that much. For this presentation, we're going to talk not just about companies that are involved in weapons in space, but in companies that are involved in space-enabled warfare. Whenever space is used to support the warfighter, either with a weapon directly in space, support instruments in space, navigation, communications, and intelligence used for warfighting, then we're going to talk about that. Within the more traditional military contractors we think of, there are two types as well. The type that everyone knows and hates, or knows and loves, or whatever, are the metal benders. These are the big, huge manufacturers of weapon and space systems. The big five, commonly known, are Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, Raytheon, and General Dynamics, many European players as well. There is also a second breed of engineering think tanks. These are prime contractors who do not build anything. They design and plan global weapons and intelligence systems. Look at this figure for a minute on the numbers involved here. Boeing's the biggie at 54 billion, although it does a lot of commercial aircraft, so we're talking about around 20 billion for annually for military. Lockheed is around the $37 billion effort. Northrop Grumman at 30.7, etc. You're talking about several tens of billions, and once you get past General Dynamics and Raytheon, the numbers drop way down. Consolidation has really driven everything to the big five these days. When you come to the big think tanks, they're just a couple $1 billion. We're not talking about gargantuan companies here. Carlyle is just over $1 billion, and they mostly are a consolidated holder of other companies. Science Applications International Corp., which is Intelligence Agency Incorporated, is at $2.2 billion. And then once again, the numbers go down quite a bit. But size matters in a negative sense here, because even though the metal benders are 10 times the size of the think tanks, they are not very profitable. The reason being, they have to maintain big plants that make stuff that have labor people, usually with union contracts, high contracts, and so if you look carefully at the website of a Lockheed Martin or a Boeing, they would like to pretend they don't build things because it is not considered cool to build things anymore. This is what has happened to the 21st century corporation. Everything possible is outsourced. There's a famous book in the 90s, Manufacturing Matters. Manufacturing doesn't matter anymore. What the modern corporation has done is to go virtual. Many of them have already owned big buildings, and they're not going to sell them off. But all of their employees are telecommuters now, and so nobody works in their offices. You go through the modern U.S. corporation, it's like a ghost town now. They may have employees, but they're out in the field, they don't exist, there's empty buildings. Now, the 21st century government is a lot like the 21st century corporation. They said, we want to outsource most of our work, even our most classified space military work. There's a couple good examples here. In the United States, the National Reconnaissance Office, the largest intelligence agency, buys 30% of all its satellite images from private satellite companies because it finds it more cost-effective than trying to build its own satellites anymore. Another example is our own lovely in Denver, Colorado, Buckley Air Force Base, one of the largest Western Hemisphere intelligence bases. It has grown by a factor of 6 since the mid-1990s, but the area inside the little enclosed classified U.S. government base hasn't grown at all. Instead, what has happened is gargantuan buildings belonging to Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman have grown up outside Buckley Air Force Base, and the National Security Agency contracts all its classified intelligence processing to go outside the base into private industry. We have the privatization of space intelligence. So what do we do with all this? We follow the programs and money. Who are the prime contractors for a specific project, and who are the subcontractors? Follow the money. It works again and again. With Aegis at the Bath Iron Works, and Bruce and others have been working at Bath for a long time. If you talk to people at the Bath Iron Works, they think they're working on ships. They don't recognize that the Aegis is the prime vehicle for theater missile defense. They don't recognize that its radar and its SM-3 short-range missiles are used not for defense, but to sail up into the harbors in Korea and elsewhere and provoke war. Forward-based provocation is as important as the missile defense equipment itself. That's why you have to tie the doctrine to the equipment. Theater missile defense does not deserve to be called defense because it is an offensive warfighting program. So the real test peace activists should use is, does a particular satellite or a ground station or a rocket play a role in preserving a stabilizing influence, or does it create a dominating warfighting influence? Under those kind of definitions, you'd see 2/3 to 3/4 of US satellites be classed as warfighter satellites. In space weapons, you have the obvious research programs like the chemical oxygen iodine laser, the airborne laser, and the space-based laser, which now is on kind of indefinite hold because the damn thing just doesn't work. But then you have the subtle, that is not so obvious, the Starfire optical range. The Air Force has now decided that space-based laser battle stations are too heavy to orbit effectively, and so they want to switch to ground-based lasers that bounce their lasers off mirrors in orbit. And the funny thing is that if a space preservation treaty were to be passed, those mirrors could still be up in the orbit, and they'd say, we don't have a weapon in space, what are you talking about? We have to look at all the support bases for this stuff. The Space Warfare Center at Schriever Air Force Base. The most important facility outside Space Warfare Center directly at Schriever is the Joint National Integration Center. It turns ballistic missile defense into one piece of a larger space warfare picture. Think of this all as not just individual reconnaissance planes, individual robot planes, individual BMD elements. It's all an integrated global space warfare structure.
Just for your information, over the weekend, Lockheed Martin announced that they have a $60 million contract from the American government to build 12 large blimps. These will be 7 times the size of the Goodyear blimp. They will have all kinds of high-tech telescopes on them. Each one will be stationed over a different portion of North America. They'll be able to survey everything that's going on in North America from about several miles up. And this will go into place 2009, I think they said.
And what do you, sir, perceive the true purpose of those blimps and the surveillance?
They're going to be watching you guys.
Not you.
The concept behind that is just what this gentleman was talking about. The idea is not just controlling orbital space, it's controlling everything from near ground air to near space, and you form a tier so that you have regular reconnaissance airplanes have been around for a long time. You have the UAVs, the robot planes that can hover. Then next phase up, you have the blimps. Then you have the short range takeoff like an airplane, behave like a rocket vehicle, the Falcon vehicle, force application for launch from the continental U.S. to the space attack plane. And then, of course, you have true orbiting vehicles. So all of this under Sega's department is like trying to find a multiple tier of reconnaissance from air through space, including near space, and including vehicles like the blimps he was discussing.
All the military branches, Air Force, Army, Navy, Marines, everybody internally has changed their designation. They don't really refer to each other as Air Force, Army, Navy, Marines. There's still a lot of old talk about that, but internally everybody is a warfighter, from Air Force cook to the general. And what they were trying to do was, coming off the strategy Vision 2020, was to integrate everyone into a battlefield kind of a concept. And what they were looking for was like a webs, what we would look at as an internet kind of an approach to warfare, where a soldier in a field could flip up a screen and pull up on his internet screen, I've got a target here, I need this type of munition, and it might come from a Navy ship, a Navy plane, or Marine plane, or an Army position somewhere 50 miles away with a cannon that could hit the target or something like that. So they were designing a computer net-centric computer warfield control to simplify and iterate. And you talked about it in terms of taking it out of the White House to the front line, and that's very true. They've done that. And in terms of discussion, that they call everybody warfighters. What this is aimed towards is turn every one of these fighting mechanisms into a mechanism to suppress populations of people, like at home or abroad. It doesn't matter whether you're in Okinawa or whether you're here in this country, you're a civilian population. And they've arranged a situation where we're all the enemy. I mean, we're the target of these people, whether it's like in South Korea or the Philippines or whatever. And I think we have to realize that, because these guys are moving in a very global controlling kind of mechanism against all of us. And it's not them over there anymore, but it's all of us here. And the way they're organized internally on this is total control. We've got to get people to realize that we have no interest in building this structure. It's to be used against all of us.
But something very profound happened around 92, 93 that paved the way for, the 1996 vision for 2020. So this was a Clinton project, initially, not a Bush project. But there was a change at the end of the Cold War. We could have chosen to back off certain things, consolidate certain programs. No, we said, this goes to serving the warfighter. And that was a Clinton project, but it was adopted and accelerated by about a 10 times over thing by Bush. But that was not a natural evolution of the kind of talk the military had engaged in the 50s and 60s, 70s, 80s. It never got as absolutely world-dominating the talk until about that 93, 94 type time frame. That was a fundamental change.
The military has long said that whoever controls the moon as a base, as a military base, will be able to control who can get on and off the planet Earth, because there's a gravity well between the Earth and the moon. And if you sit at the top of the gravity well on the moon, you can control access on and off the Earth. There's interest long-term in mining the moon for precious resources like helium-3. Also, They're talking about mining the asteroids for gold and going to Mars and mining for magnesium and uranium and cobalt and things like that. In fact, Halliburton is already working on a drilling mechanism for Mars right now. And NASA is saying that their future mining colonies on these planetary bodies will be powered with nuclear reactors. Their bases would be powered with nuclear reactors. And so this conference that Bob and I organize protests every February in Albuquerque, you go in there and you see all these displays of the Boeing and Lockheed Martin and all the rest of them, where they're working on these technologies for moon bases and nuclear reactor colonies and everything else. So this stuff is underway. So imagine a succession of launches of these materials that could then have accidents and tumble back to Earth and a whole array of other things.
Hi, my name is Byron DeLear, and I'm running for Congress in Southern California for the United States Green Party. Recently, we just took a Physicians for Social Responsibility first military tour of sites throughout Los Angeles. And right now, the DoD, the Department of Defense, stands as the worst polluter on the planet. So I just really would like to stress what the war machine has an impact on the garden that we live in and sustains us. The dominance kind of ethos and values that the war machine forwards knows no end in its ability to destroy the precious life on this planet. In fact, the Department of Defense stands today, it pollutes more than the 5 largest petrochemical corporations in the United States combined.
They have long-term and short-term enemies. Terrorism, of course, is a short-term enemy. Long-term enemy is China. And what's happening is the U.S. is now moving to militarily contain China because the U.S. fears that China will become a global economic competitor. Many people believe that the war in Iraq and a possible war in Iran is not so much because the United States uses the oil from Iraq. We don't. But China does, and other markets in the Asian Pacific region do. For example, China imports 80% of its oil through the Taiwan Straits. So it's no coincidence that the United States is rushing to militarize Taiwan and beginning to move U.S. military ships into the Taiwan Straits, Aegis destroyers outfitted with missile defense systems, to try to choke off, ultimately, China's ability to transport oil through the Taiwan Straits. So the long-term military enemy, then, is China. And if China responds defensively, they've now launched 1 military satellite so they can see the Earth below them as the United States now military encircles them. And the United States is accusing, in our papers at home, China of massively upgrading its military. So all China does is respond a little bit, and then look what's happening. China's arming. We've got to have Star Wars now because China wants to control the world. So it's all fit together nicely in a package to sell to the American people.
New Mexico, I think, is the world's largest military base. It's a colony for sure. And what Bruce was saying is most people think of it as the legacy of the Manhattan Project and the nuclear weapons that were developed at Los Alamos and tested there. But our state is an example of what's going to happen to a lot of places in the world. And I was thinking about Okinawa this morning in that slideshow we saw about, the whole island being occupied by the U.S. military. Our state is like that. Controls the politics, we got all the devastation of economically, social programs. From one end to the other, it's military bases and programs. And in addition to Los Alamos, we also have the world's largest nuclear weapons depot. The war was made, over Iraq, supposedly that there's weapons and mass destruction there. There was none there. We've got 2,500 or more of them sitting about 5 miles from our house. We have, in conjunction with that, probably one of the largest concentration of war profiteers, war contractors in the country, in our city. We've got everybody, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, Grumman, everything is there, and they all feed this kind of research project that goes on at the base and in conjunction with the university. Let me just run down some of the things that they're doing there. They're researching space
nuclear power programs. And this is the Prometheus project to build a nuclear power supply for a space-based laser. The Star Wars program that the Strategic Command and everybody talks about. It's being done at the University of New Mexico, and they lie about it, say they don't do it. We've uncovered all the research to show the tracks to it and everything, and their involvement in it. You know about White Sands, they have a ground-based laser system run by the Army which can attack satellites in orbit. That's one of the anti-satellite weapons that are being developed for the U.S. military. They've already tested it. In Albuquerque, they have another called Starfire. It was developed in conjunction with the University of New Mexico, and it's basically a ground-based anti-satellite weapon, ASAT. It's a huge project. It sits out on the mountains on the edge of our town. This Starfire project has had the capability of destroying satellites in orbit for about 10 or 12 years. And I think politically we've got to realize that they've had these kind of weapons for a long time, and why are they now going to push them openly and brag about them is a political question we need to look at. We also have the airborne laser project, which came out of Kirtland Air Force Base. You probably read a little bit about this. All the war contractors are into it. I mean, war is profitable. Militarization of space and war in space is going to be even more profitable to them. So what they do in our city for a lot of these projects is they build the prototypes, like the Predator and the Global Hawk and the E-bomb, all came out of the complex of Kirtland Air Force Base in the research lab. The first versions are created there, then they put them out for manufacturing and distribution to the military. Well, they created the airborne laser project there, which is they're putting a big chemical-fired laser on a 747. And not only are they stopping there, they're now trying to develop, in conjunction with the university and other contractors, smaller power supplies for this thing. They want to put it on C-130s, they want to put it on Humvees. A whole range and family of laser weapons are being developed to attack people of the world and to use against us. And they've developed a thing called a crowd control weapon. It's a microwave beam weapon, which, and the first one was created there and used and tested. It's basically a big microwave oven that's portable, and they can direct it and move it around and can hit a crowd of people with it, and in just an instant it will, it's what is basically, I'll get away from the techniques of it, it's boiling the water in your skin. It suddenly becomes very uncomfortable to be where you're at. And they've developed this into Iraq, and they're using it. We know that they're taking it over there and field deployed it and testing it. The evil thing about this kind of weapon is, suppose they decide to leave it on more than a microsecond, say for a half second, it's going to kill people. So this is the kind of situation we're facing in Albuquerque, and the whole project there, the Air Force Command Research Lab is trying to move all these weapons into orbit, into space. None of this is operational. Can they use it without control and dominance of space for satellites and communications and control and targeting? So our state is like integrated into this whole strategy completely, with all the negative effects of it and side effects and social consequences of the lack of spending on programs for health and population and people like that. So, which is where we sort of come into it and have been trying to bring local attention and consciousness to these things and trying to organize resistance to it. We go out and do demonstrations and try to make trouble for them and try to stop these things.
Mammoth Hill, the biggest spy base probably in the world, outside the US anyway. It's an NSA base, National Security Agency base. The golf balls at Mammoth Hill, these golf balls contain satellite dishes which receive information from satellites. Some of them are NSA, National Security Agency satellites, which are eavesdropping on other satellites and other systems from space. They beam them down to Mammoth Hill. There they have these huge computers which interrogate all the information from there and then pass on any interesting information to Fort Meade in Maryland. And by interesting information I mean they search for keywords like, I don't know, Al-Qaeda or something. And sorry? Global Network. Global Network, yeah. Well, they do that. Bruce has evidence of that happening too. So they're plugged into our telecommunications in the UK, which also includes Europe and so on. And it's not only for military purposes or so-called anti-terrorist activity, but they also use it to gain commercial advantage over companies in Europe. We started the year with blockade of Mammoth Hill, and we had the march there through New York City. In May we had a general election and we were doing some briefing notes on that. We have a stall at Glastonbury, which is probably one of the most well-known music festivals Then we were involved in a demonstration running up to the G8 meeting in Faslane in Scotland. Faslane is the base, the nuclear submarine base, where the so-called independent deterrent of the UK is housed. In July we were in Edinburgh for the rally there on the war against the war in Iraq. And we also had a demonstration on July the 4th. Every year we have a demonstration again at Menwith Hill, which is the spy base, Independence from America Day. And we had a march for peace and liberty. It was in London, again against the war, in September. In October we had a Knocking on Heaven's Door, which is Keep Space for Peace Week. Bruce came over, as I mentioned, and we got him to do a tour around the UK. Here he is at Menwith Hill. Helen John, who many of you know, who's a long-time campaigner, and Sylvia Boys is also a long-time campaigner in Yorkshire, decided to challenge the new laws, anti-terrorist laws. Under these laws, they've set up boundaries around certain installations in the UK. One of them is Menwith Hill, another is Fylingdales. If you go within the certain limits around these bases now, you're threatened with a £5,000 fine or a year imprisonment. They want to challenge these. They did that. They cut through the fence. They went through the fence at Menwith Hill. Helen certainly will be taken up in court. So she'll be able to take the argument about space weapons and the activities of the US into a higher court. Another one, Lindis, who's also another person who you may know from Campaign for Accountability of American Bases, was arrested just the other day when George Bush I came to Harrogate. He was addressing a big business lunch. Lindis got to hear about that and was waiting to welcome him despite this huge police cordon. There was a big protest as well. We were kept miles away, well not miles, but a long way away from the actual conference itself. Lindis, using her, I don't know how she does it, some sort of disguise, gets in and confronts him immediately. And this is an invitation to July the 4th, the Midsummer Ball at Menwith Hill, if you can make it. And one more thing, Keep Space for Peace Week this year. We're planning 3 demonstrations, one at Faslane, anti-Trident, one at Menwith Hill, and one at Fylingdales. So please come to the UK and join us.
Outside the United Kingdom, there is almost no protest in Europe against the developments with respect to space militarization, space weaponization, and missile defense. In particular, in the United States, the peace movement thinks they are peaceful countries and they are opposing the US, and it's actually, unfortunately, not true. I would love to have it that way. Just 3 days ago, the news got around that Belarus, that is one of the former Soviet republics, will deploy Russian missile defense systems in response to the United States announcing that they plan to deploy interceptors in Poland. This new decision is one result of the emerging arms race that is a result of the US decisions on missile defense. Europe is heavily involved in the militarization of space with a European GPS system called Galileo, and there's much more to tell, but I think this might suffice for you to understand that Europe is not the peacemaking force some people here in the Americas seem to believe, unfortunately.
Vandenberg Air Force Base is on the central coast of California. It's about 35 miles long and about 99,000 acres. It's a huge base. It has 2 sections. The northern section of the base has about 16 missile silos. We use the missile silos to test ICBM missiles. In the southern end of the base, they have launch platforms, above-ground launch platforms, where they launch rockets to carry satellites into space. The third component of Vandenberg Air Force Base is what they call the Joint Space Operations Center, which is a center that receives the data from the satellites. It's manned by members from each branch of the armed forces, and then that data is used to go out to wherever there's military operations going on, whether it's in Iraq or Afghanistan or Colombia, used for targeting purposes and for surveillance purposes. This is a good picture of the coast, and this is a Peacekeeper missile. You can't really see it for for the explosion. Very, very powerful. They take off from Vandenberg and they fly 4,200 miles across the Pacific to the Kwajalein Atoll, where the re-entry vehicle, which is an unarmed dummy nuclear warhead, has been targeted to land in the lagoon there. It travels the 4,200 miles in 20 minutes. Each test costs $50 million. So we burn up $50 million in 20 minutes and practice targeting nuclear warheads in the Marshall Islands. Marshall Islands are a much oppressed people. So they've been irradiated, contaminated, displaced, and now we use their islands for a target. Vandenberg likes to present itself as a steward of the environment, but when they launch rockets and missiles, a byproduct of the rocket engines is aluminum perchlorate, which contaminates both the soil and the groundwater. And the groundwater at Vandenberg has been contaminated to 515 parts per billion aluminum perchlorate, which a safe level is considered at 4 parts per billion, and it causes thyroid problems.
In January, a new government was elected in Canada, a conservative minority government led by Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Now, before, during, and after the election, I would like you to know that this party and this Prime Minister used and was consulted very heavily by U.S. Republicans and U.S.-based conservative and religious think tanks like the Heritage Foundation and Focus on the Family. And before becoming Prime Minister, Stephen Harper was on record in saying that he supported the war in Iraq. He's a Bush supporter. He's against women's right to choose. He's against same-sex marriage, and he's against Kyoto. And he's adopting now Bush's strategies to muzzle our media. The next person I'd like to tell you about is somebody, unfortunately, who can't vote out of office, and this is General Rick Hillier, who is the new Chief of Staff, and he was appointed by the former Prime Minister Paul Martin in February of 2005. Last year, the Walrus magazine had a picture of him on the front cover with the title, "Hillier wants to Americanize the Canadian military. Are you ready for blood?" And in a press conference last July, after just a few months in office, on the topic of Afghanistan, General Rick Hillier stated, "We are the Canadian forces, and our job is to be able to kill people." This shows a dramatic change in the nature of the Canadian military, one that Canadians believed was on peacekeeping, and now it's shifted to combat under U.S. forces.
This is not just a Republican thing. The Democrats have been in bed on this since the beginning. They vote for the research and development money dollars in the United States Congress. The Clinton administration put into the last national space policy that the U.S. will control and dominate space. But what the Bush administration is now expected to do, and the rumors are now that it's again going to be any day, that he's going to give the green light to fully test, and begin to move towards deployment of anti-satellite weapons.
When I listened to Bob speak about Mexico, I thought, you know, those people are in danger of losing touch with who it means to be a person, a human being.
Yes.
I think we're all under that assault.
Yes.
So, to summarize, the United States plans to weaponize space. The Chinese and Russian reaction will surely be to do the same thing. The potential for a horrendous, cataclysmic nuclear confrontation will be as inevitable as the fact that we are here in this room together. There's little reason to believe that traditional government diplomacy and negotiation will alter any of the above. There are currently no electable new heads of state in Canada or in the United States who are likely capable of changing any of this. So is this bleak? Yes, it's very bleak. Is it realistic? Unfortunately, yes, it's very realistic. The paramount question is, do we want to save this planet? Do we want to save our families? Do we want to save our friends? Do we want to save our civilization? Or are we going to allow the strange Lovian madmen in Washington to destroy the world?
We need to have people from the international community coming in to visit places like STRATCOM, places like SpaceCom out in Colorado Springs, places like Los Alamos and Kirkland in New Mexico, places like Vandenberg in California. The international community needs to come in there. We will provide the wonks to brief them and give them the whole story and all this, but they need to be taking this message back to their respective countries and let them know the story that Bruce has been talking about with military dominance of the United States.
My name is TJ Johnson, and I'm a city council member in Olympia, which is the capital of the state of Washington, USA. Last year, we took a local action to declare ourselves a nuclear-free zone, but we didn't just do it symbolically. We said that as a city government, we will no longer do business with anyone that profits from nuclear weapons. And I think that I think that's something people that live in cities anywhere can do, because it's very easy to elect city council members. You don't have to elect congressional representatives, presidents, etc. So I think using local government to create the economic pressure to disinvest from these companies is one of those practical steps that we ought to be taking everywhere.
We have a lot of press kit type materials like this too, and as several people have said, using culture and using humor is an absolutely necessary element in everything we do. And the way to get the media to pay attention is not to just always be doing the same things. Do unique protests like throwing bologna sandwiches at demonstrations, or making these kind of t-shirts. And that's the way to get a point across in a really effective and fun way.
I can think of only one thing that we can try: a people's revolt employing the internet. In Canada in 2004, we used the internet to dramatically turn around the debate about Canada's participation in the unworkable American missile defense plans. Through the wide dissemination of authoritative scientific information, in a few months we turned around the public opinion polls from roughly 65% in favor to 65% opposed. We had press conferences featuring our own Canadian experts, and we brought in respected experts from outside the country. We provided such an abundance of valuable information that citizens had previously not been aware of, that the growing passion and the anger across the country forced Ottawa to change its mind, with an election on the horizon and with more and more Liberal MPs opposed. The single most important effective tool that we had was the internet and the information that we provided Canadians across the country via the net.
I think it really is incumbent upon us, the elders of our society, those of us who, because of our age, we have a lot of experience, we have authority in the community, and that we are the ones that should be at this point in time going for direct action. I'm talking about nonviolent civil disobedience.
This is McGregor Eddie, who would have liked to have been here. She's being arrested. This is back last October at Keep Space for Peace Week. She was wanting to cross a green line and present articles from the Nuremberg principles to the base, to explain to them that they didn't have to be involved in a war of aggression. In fact, it was illegal for them.
What keeps me going year in and year out is knowing that everywhere you turn on this planet, there are people like you organizing. There is a global movement underway, and we are connected to that. We're always saying no, right? No to war in Iraq, no to Star Wars. I think we got to have a yes too. That yes is calling for our dollars, our tax dollars all over the world, to be used to convert the military-industrial complex globally to the production of sustainable technologies, rail systems, solar, wind, at these production facilities in all of our countries. So can we begin to integrate that into our work as well? That we call for the conversion of the military-industrial complex. Thank you all very much for coming today.